Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I think I saw a Wendigo through the train window. It is as the title states. I am fairly certain that I saw a Wendigo out the window of the train. If that were the only event that happened, then I wouldn't have any reason to tell my story. In order to get into what happened, let me start off at the beginning of my day. It was a normal Saturday as far as I was concerned. I stayed up until about 3 a.m. playing the newest online mobile game with my brothers. Yes, I know, it is considered a sin to cheat by using my brother's screens to determine who the imposter is, but I'm not getting into that debate right now. I woke up not too long after 9 a.m., played on my phone a while, and then hopped out of bed, threw on the same clothes I had on the day before, and headed downstairs to the kitchen. I threw together my favorite breakfast food while my brothers both groggily dragged their feet to meet me. My twin brother, Gabe, decided to shower to wake himself up, while my younger brother, Zach, decided to partake in the feast of homemade waffles with peanut butter and chocolate milk. By the time Gabe was dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, Zach and I had already finished putting the dishes into our dishwasher and cleaned off the table. I had packed in advance and my train wasn't for a few more hours, so my brothers and I had pulled our phones out and began terrorizing the servers of Among Us for a little while. After we grew tired from the online insults and cyberbullying that we received for cheating, we played some Mortal Kombat on our PS4. It was a very relaxing morning, all things considered. As I prepared to collect my luggage and leave for the train station, I reiterated the food plans to my siblings. The roast is in the slow cooker. All you'll have to do is clean up. It is going to be finished at 6 today, and if you aren't sure if it's done, then shoot me a picture. I continued speaking over my Gabe's attempts of assuring me that they'd be fine without me. Remember, tomorrow is oven-baked chicken fingers and fries. After school Monday is burgers, and you can order anything you want for Tuesday and pay a tip. I rushed my sentence as Gabe held the front door of our tiny rented house open for me. Chrissy, we'll be fine, okay? Chill out, okay? Gabe chuckled to himself. You're right. You'll be fine. Do your homework. I love you guys. See you Wednesday. I called to them as I headed down the paved driveway and towards the bus stop down the road. Hasta la vista, baby. As Zach yelled my favorite movie reference of all time at me, I couldn't help but smile. They'll be fine. I raised them well, I thought to myself. I looked at them waving in the open front door and gave them a very flat and stern expression. I'll be back. I deepened my voice as best as possible before smiling and heading back towards the bus stop. My parents were extremely busy people all our lives. Gabe was born with a learning disability and required more attention from my parents than I needed. I had to grow up and mature faster to be able to take care of Gabe, as our mother was a full-time principal in our local school and a part-time student tutor, while my father worked as a warehouse manager full-time and was often working the midnight shifts. He worked those shifts due to the employees' reputations to be unproductive. He always said he needed to straighten them out. My father would sleep all day and my mother would work all day. I would always prepare Gabe's lunches and walk him to school, walk him home, and make him dinner. I helped him with his homework. I read him bedtime stories. I tucked him into bed. I was always there for him. Zach was born a week before my 9th birthday with Gabe. By now, Gabe had quickly matured, surprising everyone. He was potentially even smarter and more socially acceptable than I was, though he didn't have the same parenting skills that I had developed and therefore wasn't entirely confident in even turning on an oven or setting a microwave timer. Anyways, by the time Zach came around, I was well aware that I'd have to raise him too. I so desperately wanted my mom and dad to be real parents for little Zach, to be there for him and be what Gabe and I never had. But I knew deep down inside that that wouldn't happen. By the time I was Gabe and I were 18 and Zach had just turned 9, The three of us moved out and into our own apartment. I wasn't even sure that our parents would notice Zach's absence, to be honest. They had no issues with us all moving in together. They said to me themselves that they knew Zach was better off with us than them. They said he was never supposed to be, which entirely angered me. Because of this, Gabe and I started to call Zach our miracle brother. Despite our age gap, the three of us were extremely close with one another. It was us three against the world. Nobody would change that. Then about a year ago, I fell in love with my old high school crush. His name is Brian. We were always close friends since grade 9, but as high school came to a close and we parted ways for university, we confessed our love. It was a very corny movie moment to me. Even through long distance, we made our relationship work. Gabe and Zach were obviously jealous that Brian was taking all of my attention. They were afraid that Brian was going to take me away from them. All that aside, they liked my boyfriend. They were all friendly and had good laughs together. They were happy for us. So here I am, at the train station awaiting my train to my boyfriend on our first-year anniversary. I anxiously awaited the train, wondering with me when I got back. Maybe they were mad already. Or maybe they aren't upset at all. I talked myself into thinking that I was doing the right thing, even though my stomach was turning violently. I was feeling very nauseous. It had nothing to do with anything I ate. I had a horrible feeling. Something inside me was telling me that something bad was going to happen. I didn't listen to it at the time. I thought it was all just the nerves of traveling. I was just too excited to see Brian. The train was quite long. It went from my small little town of southern Ontario to the northern and frigid climate that is stereotypically portrayed as all of Canada. Overall, the trip to Brian's apartments was close to 12 hours. However, that includes the train ride along with the bus and the drive that Brian has to take from his apartment to where I arrive on the train and back to his apartment. I had boarded the train and been seated when one of the train staff members asked to scan my ticket. I quickly apologized for not being prepared and dug through my luggage to find my ticket. After ensuring that I was settled and asking if I had wanted any food or drink for the ride, the staff member had moved along down the aisle. I looked around the car, noticing only 3 other passengers before pulling out my laptop from my bag and popping my headphones into my ears. I sent a text to my parents informing them of my absence from my hometown for the next few days and threw on some YouTube. Gaming channels were always a favorite, but recently Gabe had gotten me hooked onto a game theory channel. I could sit there for hours watching the different conspiracy theories about video game lore, and for the first half of my trip, that's exactly what I did. The early winter sunset filled the skies with orange and pink highlights as I had decided to put my laptop away and watch the window with my music playlist on. I had always enjoyed listening to music on long trips, especially across the country. I tried to imagine cheesy movie scenes taking place in the open fields with slow songs playing and faceless couples slow dancing. Within about an hour after I first peered out my window, the snow had begun. At first, it was a light flurry, hardly visible as the train sped along the tracks. Eventually, it was blizzarding. Simply looking outside gave me chills, as I never enjoyed being in the snow. Snow is pretty, but from afar, I'd always say. I shivered underneath my thick leather jacket as the train came to a slow stop in a remote northern town. This was not my stop, as the train station itself was visibly the largest building in the entire town. Anyone could stand on one end of the town and see the other side down the road, even in the blizzard-like conditions that were present. As the train waited, I kept my eyes focused outside my window. No passengers had left the car, and no additional passengers had boarded. I found this to be very strange, as the train needed to always stay on schedule. Little time was available for simply stopping. There must have been something wrong with one of the employees or the conductor, or possibly even the train itself. Attention passengers, we apologize for the delay. We will continue on our trip in 5 minutes. Once again, we apologize for the delay. We thank you for choosing to ride with us and enjoy your evening. The overhead speakers broke through my thoughts and pulled me back into reality. I simply looked around the car for a moment, and then texted Brian to let him know of the 5-minute delay. When I looked back outside my window again was when I saw it. The tall figure was hunched over and with its back towards me. I could see the back of its white skull and its antlers broken and distorted. It was extremely frail, its limbs impossibly long and spindly. The creature was in the tree line across the town. Hardly any specific details were noticeably through the extreme snow, however I recognized right away the creature. Doubt it settled in almost as fast as the creature seemed to appear. Has it always been there? Was my mind playing tricks on me? It became more and more obvious the longer I gawked at it. How had I not noticed it until now? What the hell? I whispered under my breath. At the moment, I was so quiet that I wasn't even sure I had said it out loud. Just as soon as I questioned, the creature whirled its head at a near 180-degree angle to face me. The black pits for eyes stared deep into my soul. This creature had heard me, and now this creature had seen me. I was sure of it. Its mouth unhinged and an animal's corpse fell out, blood spilling everywhere. Whatever this creature had been consuming was too mangled to determine what it really was. The train jolted to life and crawled across the tracks, gradually gaining speed. I was startled from the sudden movement and jumped nearly out of my seat. The creature only stared as I sped off. I scrambled to get my laptop out of my bag and reconnect it to the train's Wi-Fi. I spent the last 2.5 hours of my trip researching the creature. This is where I had learned of its name, Wendigo. This creature had been a part of native folklore for many generations. I nearly couldn't hold my dinner, and when I read about the stories of cannibals becoming Wendigos hundreds of years ago, after reading other people's close encounters online, I was more and more convinced that what I saw was real. I was ready to move on and forget about my encounter with the Wendigo by the time I stepped off the train. I practically fell into Brian's arms and broke down, a mixture of fear and emotions of sadness and loneliness overtaking me all at once. I was grateful to be there with him, in his arms when I needed him most. I told him about my encounter with the cryptid on the drive back to his apartment. I believe that you definitely saw something, he began, his doubt unintentionally present in his voice. I just don't believe that a creature like that exists is all. Like, how come the only solid proof of its existence are tall tales and folklore? I don't know, Brian. I quietly looked to my feet. He reached one of his hands off the wheel and held mine firmly and reassuringly. I don't know what it is, I guess. It feels real to me. Well, that's good enough for me, he said calmly. That's enough reason for me to keep you safe. His classic cute grin formed on his face, revealing only a few of his nearly perfect white teeth. Oh, you need a reason to keep me safe, I jokingly said, as if he had said something offensive. Well, no. He stumbled over his words. Who? I made it comically clear that I was not believing him. Brian had managed to make me forget all about my terrible experience hours ago. We were laughing and joking around as he pulled into his parking space in his apartment complex. The building itself hadn't been very tall, only about 10 stories. The building itself was nearly completely surrounded by dark Canadian woods. His town wasn't very large, only about 8,000 residents. Beautiful lush evergreen forests surrounded the little city, with nearly every house having its own tree in the front lawn. Sparkling white snowflakes gently fell around me as I stepped out of Brian's car. The parking lot was lightly covered in snow before I had managed to make it to the entrance of the building. Brian, like the gentleman he is, carried my luggage from the car into the apartment. He was talking about one of the regular customers at his fast food part-time job when I cut him off. Listen, I said in a hushed whisper. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Goosebumps formed all over my body. Someone was watching us. I could feel it. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I don't hear anything, Chris. Exactly. It's so quiet. There weren't any noises around. Not a single sound. Only the eerie dead silence. Is it always this quiet? In the middle of the night? Yeah, it is. Brian wasn't making me feel any better. What's wrong, Chrissy? You still spooked? Let's just go inside. I don't like it out here. I clung onto his arm and rushed towards the front doors. Once inside and in the elevator, I told him what I read online. I explained that the absence of any natural noises or wild animals typically means there's a predator around. With his apartment complex close to some dark woods, I wasn't very calm. I also told him how I felt that we were being watched from something in the woods. Babe, your nerves are probably just shot. He held me close to him, trying to calm me down. I promise you're safe here. It's gone. I promise. He drifted off. That night I dreamed that the creature had followed us. I saw from its point of view as it followed our car towards Brian's apartment. I saw as it watched us get out from the car and head inside. And I saw as it crawled into bed behind me, holding me in place. Don't move, it hissed, its hot breath on my ear. I woke up in a cold sweat. Brian was sound asleep beside me, looking peaceful as ever. I went to the kitchen and got myself a glass of water. I put on my warm, fuzzy housecoat over top of my pajamas and stood outside on the balcony. Some fresh air would do me good, I thought to myself. It was 3:20 in the morning, and there I was on the balcony of the 7th floor, contemplating a cigarette. I wanted to quit ever since I had taken ownership of my brothers, but on that balcony I felt as though I had so desperately needed one. Feeling ashamed of myself for even considering one, I threw the only cigarette I had off the balcony. I needed to get a hold of myself before I returned home. I couldn't let Zach see me like this. Gabe would scold me if he were here, I thought. Wiping tears off my face, I looked around the tree line. I was just starting to regain my composure when I noticed something out of place. In the tree line was the deer skull. The horrid creature's body was undoubtedly attached to it. It just stared at me. I whirled around and nearly dove inside Brian's apartment. I slammed the balcony glass door shut and locked it. As I headed to make sure the front door was locked, Brian intercepted me, forcing a scream out of me. What's the matter? Christina. Brian held me by my arms. I wouldn't stop wailing. All that I could get out was, "It's following me," in between the sobs. He held me in a close hug until I was calm enough to explain my nightmare and about the creature I saw mere moments ago. "Stay here," he said as he headed towards the balcony and took a look outside. I watched as he unlocked the door and stepped onto the balcony. A chill went down my spine, but not because of the wintry night air flowing into the apartment. Brian just stood there, staring at one spot. After a long pause, he slowly backed into the apartment, not taking his eyes off the creature outside. I knew he saw it. I knew he believed me. I could see it in his face. His eyes wide with fear, his mouth only slightly ajar. Without looking at me, he said, "The parking lot is in the back of the complex. Get your things. We can't stay here." "Are you crazy? That thing is outside. It's following me." I nearly yelled, panic setting in. I felt as though I was going to vomit. That thing. It told me Brian was in terror. I don't know how, but it told me that it was going to come inside. I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "We have to go," he urged. I grabbed his hand and he grabbed his keys and we rushed out the front door. We ran to the elevator and rapidly hit the down button. I decided that taking the stairs was faster and bolted through the door towards the stairs, Brian following right behind me. Reaching the stairwell, I looked to the bottom before descending the stairs. About halfway down the first flight, I heard heavy tapping coming from the bottom. I leaned over the banister and saw the undead deer creature making its way up the stairs. Brian nearly bumped into me as I spun around and sprinted up the stairs crying and screaming. He followed my lead without question as I headed towards the elevator, doors just beginning to open. We both cramped ourselves into the elevator and Brian rapidly pushed the ground floor button. Just as the double doors slowly closed, we saw the stairwell doorway open and the animal's snout making its way towards us. We held each other, Brian verbally praying and me regretting most of my past life's choices. Ground floor and parking, the elevator dinged, cueing us to make our hasty escape. We ran like our lives depended on it, because in those long moments, they did. On our way to Brian's car, I slipped and fell into the snow. Brian, who was ahead of me, turned around and prepared to help me up. No, go. Start the car. Go. I yelled frantically as I slowly made my way to my feet. He spun around and ran towards the car again. I took one step forward and fell to my knees, pain pulsing through my ankle. I loudly groaned in pain, clenching my teeth. I managed to get to my feet and half-limp, half-jogged to the car. Just as I closed the passenger door, the front doors of the apartment complex were violently torn from their hinges. The creature held nothing back as it sprinted on all fours towards the car. Hang on. Brian shifted the car into drive and floored it. Normally, the wintry road conditions would have evoked anxiety in me, but right now I felt as though Brian wasn't driving fast enough. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching the creature gallop towards us, its skinny form seemingly moving in unnatural angles with each step. Are you all right? Brian asked of deep concern, his eyes trained on the road ahead. I think that I broke my ankle. I managed to get out in between breaths. He cursed under his breath. I don't think we can get you to a hospital with that thing on our asses, Brian thought out loud. Did you bring your phone? I asked him. I'm going to call the police. Damn it. No, I left mine at the apartment, Brian said plainly. I quietly sobbed as I too had left my phone in the rush. We are going to die tonight, aren't we? I said out loud, not wanting an answer. No, babe, don't say that. Things are going to be fine. We'll make it out of this. Will we? Will we actually, Brian? I yelled at him, tears streaming down his face too. He was terrified, just like me, and yet he was trying to protect me and keep me calm. I stumbled an apology in between sobs, but Brian cut me off. It's gone. He slowed the car to a stop and looked all around. Where did it go? It's gone. Where did it go? I too began to look around, unease settling in. I'm not sure what was more horrific, seeing the creature pursue us or not being able to see it but feel that it was still there. We sat there in the car for a long while, just looking around desperately. In the distance down the road, I noticed headlights. I pointed them out to Brian, and he flashed his high beams off and on. The car pulled over to the side of the road, and Brian got out to talk to the driver. I bit my lip, not enjoying the idea of Brian getting out of the car. Please, call the police. We need an ambulance too. I heard Brian talk to the driver. Just as Brian made his way back to the car, the creature came out of the darkness and took him in its grasp. It happened so quickly. He was just gone. Only a few drops of blood on the ground to prove that he was even there. The man in his car across the road screamed and sped off. I sat there, stunned and no doubt in shock. The monster rammed into my passenger side door head first, breaking me from my trance. It broke through the window and shoved its face towards me. I struggled against my seatbelt and repeatedly kicked it in its hollow skull. It caught my leg in its mouth and clamped its jaws down hard. I screamed from the pain, blood pooling around my wounds. I heard the horrific sound of my leg being bitten through as the beast crunched through bone. All I could do was scream. Biting down on my other leg, it pulled me through the window. I screamed for my life, but it was no use. With ease, it had flung me face first into a nearby tree, and everything went black instantly. My entire body seared with pain as blurry images of men and women in police uniforms and rescue uniforms loaded me onto a bed and into an ambulance. I was drifting in and out of consciousness. When I had finally come to full consciousness, I was in a hospital bed and hooked up to countless pieces of machinery. I had a feeding tube and an oxygen tube in me. My arm had an 4 in it, heartbeat monitors attached to my chest. The nurse reading my file gasped when she saw me awake and rushed out of the room. The PA system announced several doctors to where I assumed I was located. Within minutes, the doctors were unhooking the feeding tube and oxygen tube, as I had no longer needed them. We expected you to be in a coma for at least another month, one of the doctors explained to me after the tubes were removed. Another month? I asked before clearing my throat. It still felt as though I had those plastic tubes shoved down my throat. You were out for 6 weeks. You were in a very brutal car accident. While waiting for the emergency vehicles to arrive, you were attacked by an animal. It was a very horrible scene. I blankly stared at him. Don't you remember, Christine? He cocked his head to the side and gave me a quizzical look. It's Christina, I corrected him. And no, I don't. I lied. I laid there for hours remembering the horrible nightmare that happened to me nearly 2 months ago. My whole body ached and pulsed with pain. I could hardly move. I thought about Brian for the longest time. I assumed he had to be dead, but he had shown up later that night. I came as soon as I heard that you were awake, he told me as he leaned over and kissed my forehead. After the creature had attacked me, it went for you. I watched as it threw you against the tree. I tried to pull it off you, but it threw me away. It told me that it wanted you. It told me that you saw something that you weren't supposed to see. Brian explained. By the time the police and ambulances showed up, the creature had already left. I never saw it leave. It was just somehow gone. I rode with you in the back. The officers recorded it as a bear attack. They didn't believe my story. Brian went on to say that he was administered into the hospital for a day with only flesh wounds and stitches. He said that he and my brothers and parents visited me nearly every day or so. My parents came? I asked, stunned. He nodded, giving me a half smile. In fact, they gave me a call on my way here. They're headed up with your brothers. They said that they'll try to get here before breakfast. When they got the call that you were awake, they pretty much dropped what they were doing and hopped in the car. I teared up and smiled. What did you tell them about what happened? The police told them what they thought happened. I went with it because I want them to like me. I giggled. Then I struggled to sit up. Brian rushed over to give help and sit me up. I reached down to scratch my leg, but I couldn't quite find the spot. Hey, hon, can you help me? I've got an itch and I can't reach it. I'm too sore to be reaching down. I looked at Brian, and he smiled back at me. Sure, babe. Whereabouts? My left leg, just below the kneecap. Brian went pale suddenly. What's wrong? I removed the blankets as a wave of adrenaline washed over me. Both of my legs were gone from just above the knees. I was still coping with my new handicap when my younger brothers, accompanied by my parents, rushed into the room and nearly knocked the wind out of me in a big hug each. Guys, I'm okay. I'm all right. I laughed a little out loud from pure happiness. They said you might not wake up. Zach sobbed as he held me close. They were talking to Mom and Dad about having to pull the plug on you. Gabe said grimly. Oh, guys. Doctors aren't always right. Look, I'm fine. Then I looked to my parents, both of them clearly holding back tears. We love you so much, Christina. Don't you ever go thinking otherwise. My mom's voice on the verge of breaking. Come back and live with us, okay? You'll be needing someone to look after you. My father chimed in. I'll have Gabe dash. I started. We've moved back in with Mom and Dad, Gabe said, giving me a warm smile. I looked over to Brian, who gave me a you should listen to them. Look with a smile to top it off. I'll come back home. When they let me out of here, I couldn't finish. I cried of happiness. My parents loved me after all. My parents embraced me in a hug each, and my dad stepped out of the room to talk to one of the nurses. How was the drive up? I asked my mom, wiping a tear from my face. Oh, not too bad. The first few hours there was a little snow, but once we passed through Oshawa, Toronto area, it wasn't too bad. Oh, nice. I trailed off. Oh, Chrissy. Zach grew excited. I saw something really cool on the drive up. Oh, that's right. Go on, tell your sister, my mom encouraged. It was a bear-looking creature, but it was wearing this animal skull. I think it was a deer's skull. And the bear looked real skinny and tall. Isn't that something? My mom looked at me. I just looked to Brian. I knew I was probably as pale as he was in that moment. I didn't see anything, Gabe stated matter-of-factly. I ignored him. Yeah, it was freaky, Gabe missed it. I saw it too. I don't think your father saw it. My mother's voice grew distant as I stared at Brian. Are you okay? You don't look so good. Someone asked me, but I wasn't sure who. Maybe you all should go home early. I'll bring Chrissy back down when she's out of the hospital. Brian said. You all have lives to get back to. Oh, Brian, that's so sweet of you, but we'll pass. We've got a hotel room nearby, and we took the boys off school, my mom said in her fake cheery voice. Mom, I stated in the most serious tone I could muster up. Listen to me very carefully. You have seen something that you weren't meant to see. That thing. It's on its way right now. I teared up. It's coming to find you. And little Zachy. Second story. My Deep Woods experience. All you need to know before I begin this story is, I am a fervent camper. I often take prolonged camping trips alone, and I am very apt at outdoor crafts and am no stranger to being outside in the wilderness, often alone. I still camp to this day, although this experience was the direct cause of a nearly 3-year break in these solo expeditions. I am not willing to divulge any information about myself, my country of origin, or the location of said experience. I will start from the point at which I arrived at a national park that will remain unnamed. I pulled my 2007 Skoda Octavia into a gravel car park and allowed my eyes to wander across the towering fir trees, tightly packed together, shielding the woodland beyond from any of the ever-ebbing sunlight. I'd arrived at the park at 5 p.m., and it was late autumn, so the sun was lowering in the sky beyond the mountains that encapsulated the valley I was in. There were a few other cars sitting in the open space. Some of them were empty, seemingly left by other campers, where 2 had small groups gathered, unslinging packs and stowing camping gear in the rear of the vehicles. I took a deep breath and opened my car door. I walked around to the back of my car and unlocked it. I removed my backpack from the car and slung it over my shoulders. I took my bedroll and tucked it under my arm before locking up my car. I wheeled on my feet, ready to lose myself in nature for a glorious weekend of solitude. I nodded happily to other hikers on my way to the beginning of the trail and set off into the park. I was fairly experienced when this happened, having been a hiker and camper for 13 years already, and a mountain rescue worker for 9 of those. As such, I tended to get off of the trails whenever I could and find secluded, isolated spots in the woods. I also packed emergency gear, including a flare gun and blank-firing pistol for signaling to others I was in danger. Where I come from, hunting is somewhat restricted, however much of the rules to hunting still applied, one of which was 3 rapid shots usually meant someone is in trouble and can be used as a way to signal others that you might be lost or hurt. I got off of the trail after around 30 minutes of brisk hiking, and as the daylight wavered ever lower in the sky, I cut myself a path through the thick foliage. The sun had set after about another hour and a half of trekking, and I began using my headlamp. It wasn't much longer before I heard what I had been looking for. When researching the park a week before, I had found a forest survey map, which detailed a mountain stream that fed out of the mountains down into the woods below for around 12 miles, which was situated about 4.5 miles from the trail I had entered on. The sound of babbling water lured me to the edge of the stream, where I cleared a small area for my camp. I erected my tent and gathered some rocks from the brook, which I used to create a small fire at. I checked my watch, which read 7:50 p.m. I decided it was as good a time as any to eat something, so I got out some beef from my cooler compartment in my backpack and took out one of my steel skewering rods from my kit. After I cooked the meat and drank some water, I decided I wanted to sit in the woods for a bit, taking in the darkness and the sounds. I killed the fire, keeping my fire-starting kit just inside the tent flap, and hung an electronic lantern in my tent, remembering to remove the rain/smoke cap so that the light would be visible through the mosquito netting on the top. I picked my way towards the brook, which I was probably around 5 meters or so away from, and sat on the edge listening to the water trickling. It was deathly silent apart from the brook and the gentle rustling of trees. I could hear the occasional fox whoop and leaves brushing and twigs cracking in the distance. I sat like that for maybe an hour or so before deciding that I wanted to get some sleep, as I had planned a hearty trek up into the mountains the next day. And I would have to start early if I wanted to have a chance of reaching the upper plateau where I could repitch my tent. Plus, I'd have to leave myself some extra time to fit the storm straps to it, as the winds tended to gust at around 40 miles per hour on in the mountains. I moved back to my tent, following the lamplight until I reached the zippers. I opened it up and sealed myself inside, laying back on my sleeping bag. I stared up at the lantern, before then reaching up and turning the knob on the side until it dimmed to darkness, and then finally off. I sighed heavily. I specifically remember the smell of the woods in the air and how quiet it was. No road noise carried this far out into the trees. It was magical. I loved every moment of it. It wasn't long, though, before I heard something abruptly interrupting my peaceful night in the wilderness. I stirred and raised my head, squeezing my watch to illuminate the digital screen. 1:34 a.m. bleared into my eyes. I listened intently, turning my right ear towards where I thought the sound was coming from. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut to focus my senses. It sounded like movement, as if something was walking through the woods. The harder I listened, the more I started to realize it sounded bipedal, like a person walking through the woods, dragging their feet through the fallen leaves. Who the fuck would be out here at 1:30 in the morning in the pitch black? I thought to myself. I wondered if someone was perhaps lost. It didn't make sense for a hiker to be out here in the dark wandering around. That's just a really good way of getting yourself lost. And even search and rescue don't search in the darkness unless absolutely necessary. And when we do, we use extremely powerful lights, and 90% of the time a supporting helicopter will provide FLIR to aid a search. I sat up in my sleeping bag, and it fell away from my shoulders. I felt the penetrating cold suck the heat away from my body as I went rigid, concentrating in the darkness, trying to get my eyes to adjust to it and my ears to focus. The sound of the walking seemed to come closer, and I felt my heart pick up a little. I decided that if they came too close, I'd call out. I wanted whatever it was to know I was listening. If it was an animal, it would surely run away. If it was a human, they might need help. And if not, they may think twice about coming any closer. The steps came closer still, so I called out, "Who's there? Do you need help?" In the moments that passed, I could hear my heart thundering in my ears. The footfalls had abruptly stopped, as if whatever or whoever it was had frozen in place. I wasn't too worried about animals where I was. The fauna was not considerably dangerous. Wild hogs were the most dangerous creatures out there. Although I admit when they're pissed off enough, they can be more than a match for people. Hogs are nocturnal, however, but the footfalls sounded too heavy and careless for a wild pig. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing came back. All of a sudden, I heard a loud crack right next to my left side, as if someone had slapped a stick into a tree trunk and broken it in half, like I would as a kid. I fumbled for my flashlight and illuminated the end of the tent. It was only then I saw a crumpled piece of material laying at the foot of my sleeping bag. The tent cap. I hadn't put it back on. It was then that I became all too aware that there was a rather large window in the roof of my tent for any would-be stalker. Slowly, I raised my eyes to it. I had spent nearly a decade of my life working out in the wild. I wasn't easily scared. But what I saw above my head in the torchlight terrified me. There above my face were a set of wide, crazed eyes staring back at me from the void. I screamed aloud and dropped the light, fumbling madly to peel my sleeping bag off of me and scooped it back up. My fight or flight had kicked in, and I wasn't going anywhere. I tore out of the tent and spun around to face it, yelling angrily, "What the fuck are you doing?" I was met with endless black. Nothing was there. My tent flapped lazily in the gentle breeze. No one was around. I circled the tent a few times, after retrieving my high-powered headlamp, scanning the trees around me. Nothing. I finally crawled back into the tent, noting that it was now nearly 3 a.m. I didn't sleep that night. I just waited eagerly for the first sign of daylight, and in the chilly morning air, I decided I would just get out of the woods and head up to my mountain camp. The camping areas on the plateau were popular, and usually tents would pitch all along there during the spring to autumn months, so I knew I'd likely be within a few hundred meters of plenty of other hikers or campers 24/7. In the dim dawn, I feverishly packed away my tent and hoisted my gear onto my back before heading towards the ever-increasing gradients of the foothills of the mountains at the edge of the valley. The whole while trying to banish the thoughts of the previous night from my mind. As I walked through the undergrowth towards the mountains, I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder. The events of the previous night played on my mind over and over, like a broken record on a loop. The footsteps, the snap, the eyes. It was horrifying. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that it had happened in the early hours of the morning. No one in their right mind would be out in the woods at that hour. It seemed so inexplicable. The going wasn't too tough. The gradient slowly increased, and the air began to thin out a little as I gained altitude. Eventually, I found myself transitioning from grass and foliage underfoot to gravel and rock on narrow paths leading up the sides of the mountains. As I began to climb higher, the wind picked up, and a thick, heavy fog set in, like a dirty white blanket, wisping and snaking around myself in the rocky terrain. Tufts and patches of mountain grass jutted out every few feet, and shocks of small mountain conifers stood in small groups here and there. I suddenly realized that I was getting quite cold, so I pulled my windbreaker out of my backpack and pulled it on. As I turned back to zip my bag up, something gave me pause. Just about over the top of the sound of the wind lashing against the rocks and whipping through the conifers, I could hear what sounded like singing. I listened intently, hunched over my backpack. Yes, it was singing. I couldn't quite make out the words, but I recognized the tune and timbre of it. I decided to wait to see if I could spot the other hiker. I'm usually a solitary person, but it would have been nice to see another friendly face after the night before. I stood up, slowly pulling the bag onto my back and crossing my arms against the wind. I peered into the thick fog in the direction of the singing. I began to realize I could make out the words now. It was getting closer. It was a song from the 30s by Fats Waller. Eerily, on the breeze, in a low, slightly discordant tone, I could hear the words, "Be sure it's true when you say, I love you, because it's a sin to tell a lie." My grandmother would always sing that song, so I knew it well. It was an odd juxtaposition. On the one hand, it brought back warm memories of times gone by in my grandmother's kitchen in the 80s, watching her cooking, mixed with the slightly unnerving trepidation of finding out who was up on this trail with me in the fog. As these thoughts swirled around my head, I became aware that the singing had now stopped, and that I could see the outline of a person walking slowly towards me. Whoever it was quite thin and didn't seem to be wearing a whole lot. It looked like they were wearing a poncho or tunic or something. Then, the figure came out from the fog, and around 3 feet away from me stood a man. He was thin, but sinewy and looked well-weathered and strong. He had a long, stained beard, which was salt and pepper-colored. His hair, too, was long and thinning. He had an oddly calming stare, but his whole presence seemed to be one of ownership, as if I was in his home, and he was trying to figure out how I'd got in, which was insane, as we were in the middle of nowhere. He was indeed wearing a long tunic, which seemed to be made from the hide of different animals sewn together with twine: deer, boar, rabbit, and fox. He stood for a few moments regarding me, and it wasn't until I noticed what he was holding in his hand that I became scared. In his left hand, he held what looked to be a handmade knife, made with bone and twine for a grip. He glanced down at the blade as he noticed I was staring at it. He made a flicking motion with it, before letting out a childish chuckle, lowering his head and bringing his shoulders up like a little boy caught with something he knew he shouldn't have. His smile was blood-curdling. It consisted of jagged, broken, yellowy rotting teeth, with what looked like flesh and stringy roots stuck in between the bombed-out city-esque disaster zone which was his mouth. As I began to take a step back, He playfully stepped forward to match me, in an over-exaggerated, almost childlike manner. I felt like I was trapped in a Mexican standoff, and my heart was punching the inside of my chest. I wanted out, and I wanted out right then and there. I held up my hands, and he giggled maniacally. The guy was clearly disturbed. It was only then that I began to realize this was probably who had been peering through my tent the night before. What happened next was completely involuntary, and looking back on it now as a veteran SAR officer and outdoorsman, I feel ashamed to admit, but tears welled up in my eyes and rolled down my cheeks, and I choked out an, "I'm sorry," as to apologize for whatever it was I had done to offend this man so much as to feel the need to stalk me. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 thoughts per second, and suddenly I had a flash of inspiration, which I sorely wish I hadn't had. If it was the same guy, he'd ran off the night before when I came out to challenge him. So with a sudden burst of energy, I lurched forward and took 5 great steps towards him. He didn't move an inch. Apart from the half-step forward he took to slip that blade into my stomach. I didn't even feel it at first. I looked down at the warm patch accumulating on my lower tummy and saw blood seeping over the knife and onto his hand. He pulled it out slowly and raised the knife to his mouth. He put the blade inside and again in a childish manner, sucked on it as if it were a lollipop, and made another childlike mm sound, his eyes glistening happily. I felt my knees buckle below me, and I fell sideways. And then I was falling, spinning, rolling, faster and faster. I had fallen over the side of the trail. I don't remember the entire journey down, but I certainly remember the abject searing pain in my stomach and lower limbs that greeted me when I came around. I groaned in agony, which turned into a scream. The pain in my lower body was horrendous. I looked at my legs and saw that whilst they didn't appear broken, there was a large spindly branch sticking out from my lower left calf muscle. Blood had also pooled underneath my belly, where a deep penetrating wound was still oozing the scarlet liquid. My survival mode kicked in. I sat up, forcing myself to consciousness. I needed a salve or a binding. I pulled myself off the floor, which was possibly one of the hardest affairs of my life. My wounds made it feel as though I had been struck down with the flu. My strength sapped. I limped towards a birch tree and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw it was next to a mountain stream. Sadly, it was not the one from earlier in my hike, as I would come to find out. I pulled some leaves from the tree and noted as my despair sank ever higher, my backpack was missing, likely on my long fall from the mountains above. I stumbled to the stream and began splashing my stomach with the fresh, cool water, before holding the leaves loosely in my hands to clean them to the best of my ability. I then removed my windbreaker carefully and sat on the bank. I removed my jumper and then my thermal t-shirt until I was shirtless. This was going to hurt. I mushed the leaves together and tore a sleeve from my thermal t-shirt and wrapped them up inside of it. Then with a deep breath, I pushed it into my wound as a form of rudimentary gauze. I knew that sometimes when patients underwent multiple stage surgeries, doctors and surgeons would leave gauze packed inside of the body temporarily, so I hoped this might do a similar trick. The pain was tremendous. Imagine the kind of cramps you get when you're violently ill, then multiply by 10 and add a hot white searing pain. I then tore the shirt in half and wrapped it tightly around my stomach. Blood was seeping through still, and I knew unless I got to help soon, or at least found a way to close the wound properly, I wouldn't last long. I pulled my other layers back on, before turning my attention to the stick in my leg. I could see it was in the muscle, which wouldn't be too bad, so long as I could keep it clean. I sat for 5 minutes, to give myself time to recuperate from my previous do-it-yourself medical procedure, and then took another deep breath. Gripping the stick tightly, I pulled. I thought the knife wound hurt, but oddly, this was possibly the worst pain I'd ever felt in my life, likely because the stick was jagged and had knots and lumps all over it. As I pulled, my vision flickered and failed, and my strength left me. I maybe got it an inch or so out before I had to stop. I couldn't let myself pass out. It could be a death sentence. I took a few sharp breaths, and then with all my remaining might, I ripped the stick clean out of my calf and screamed in agony. Bright white lights danced in my eyes as I fell back into the leaves and passed out. I came to, and I had no idea how long it had been, but it hadn't seemed long. The sun was still high in the autumn sky. That was the one thing I was glad for throughout this ordeal. Apart from up in the mountains, the sky was always clear and blue. In the daytime, that is. I sat up, noticing the dried blood on my jean leg. I pulled myself up and limped to the stream, where I rolled up the leg of my jeans to wash the wound. I then used the remaining material from my t-shirt I had torn up and soaked it in the water. I then wrung out the sodden cloth as best I could before wrapping it around my punctured muscle. Breathing a sigh of accomplishment, I decided to rest on a rock, but for no longer than a few moments. I knew the key to my survival would be to keep active, keep moving, and a whole lot of luck that I didn't run into that man again. After a short rest, I excitedly began to follow the stream. Luckily, there was no sight of the man who'd attacked me on the trail in the mountains. I was hoping against all hope that this stream might be the same as the one from my earlier camp, or maybe connected to it. As stated before, I would not be so lucky. I followed the stream for most of the day until the sun began to once again dip in the sky. I knew that without shelter in the autumn air, a windbreaker would likely not keep me alive. It is at this point that I must stress that I truly believe only my survival training helped me through this. I would honestly recommend that anyone with outdoors interests or who lives near a heavily wooded area take a course on survival. I decided that I needed to make some kind of shelter whilst I still had sunlight. I knew that so long as I had the stream to drink from, as it was clear flowing water coming down from the mountain, I could survive for longer than without, and food was less important. I used my remaining energy to dig a small, grave for want of a better word, and then I found some fir trees and snapped some lower branches from them. I knew that if I lay in my little grave and covered myself with the fir tree limbs, I could at least keep myself somewhat warm. I had only a survival knife in my windbreaker, which I was lucky didn't break my ribs as I fell from the mountain trail, and my mobile phone, blank firing gun, flare gun, tent, survival kit, and pretty much anything else I would have desperately needed were in the backpack, which was now either strewn across a mountain slope or in the hands of that maniac. In a sudden fit of spite, I remember hoping he'd lost the backpack and that he had to continue living in the squalid way he had been for as long as possible, although he seemed a little too far gone to probably care about his conditions for life anymore. However, whoever he was clearly adept at survival. As the sun lowered in the sky further, and the night began to fall, I slumped down into the earthy cot I had constructed and pulled some branches piled next to me on top of me. I doubted I would get much sleep, but I was proven wrong, as within the first 5 minutes of laying in that ditch, exhaustion took over me. I woke with a start at what I imagined to be sometime in the early hours of the morning. I forgot to mention until now, but my watch had been smashed during my fall and now no longer worked, so I had no means of telling what time it was. I was racked with pain, aching all over, from both my wounds and my awkward sleeping arrangements. At least I hoped that's what it was, and not the start of an infection. I lay in the still and dark of the cold night for a few moments, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was only then that the realization of my predicament hit me fully. The smell of pine needles, tree sap, and earth in my nostrils, and the biting cold stinging my feet and hands and face, brought it all crashing down on me. I felt a pit form in my stomach as I came to terms with the fact that I may very well die out here. I contemplated that realistically, I had no way of knowing where I was. I hadn't checked my map on the trail, because I hadn't reached any of the points I had planned to stop at after a certain distance, so I didn't know if I'd curved around the mountain towards the north, if I had fell on a bend to the west, or if I'd still been on the south part of the trail when I fell. If I had fallen much past the western bend, I was fucked. Beyond the woodland that skirts the southern mountain trails, There's not a lot else other than hundreds of miles of dense forest, ravines, mountains, and plateaus. Just as these thoughts peppered my brain like buckshot after buckshot, I heard a distant sound that made my blood chill to ice. Somewhere, way off in the distance, I could hear a low sound. Millions of hearts have been broken just because these words were spoken. I love you. Yes, I do. I love you. If you break my heart, I'll die. I could hear my own breath become rapid and shallow, my heart pulsing in my ears. The cold fled from my body as adrenaline began to rush through me, and pain melted away. I sat stock still in the blackness, focusing on the familiar sound. I squeezed my eyes shut. I clearly remember thinking to myself, it's just a nightmare, a hallucination. There's no way he's found you in this wilderness. And just like that, the next thing I remember is being woken by sunlight, shining through the trees. I panicked for a moment, flying out of my ditch, my brain hard booting itself into fight or flight mode. I must have passed out from shock or something. My eyes darted around, scanning every single tree in my periphery. I couldn't see anything. I felt completely exhausted as my adrenaline began to crash. I was convincing myself it had been a hallucination brought on by extreme cold and hunger. It wasn't until I had been down to the stream to clean my wounds, take a drink, and refresh myself by pushing cold water over my head that I noticed something. Nearby to where I had dug my little earth coffin, on the trunk of one of trees I had gathered some of the pine limbs from, was a deer skull. It wasn't there before. I know that for a fact. My poor heart must have been drained from all the arrhythmia in its cadence, constantly going from resting to racing to slowing in the cold, as once again, my heart rose to a sickening crescendo as I slowly approached the skull. In the center of its head, in between where the antler stumps were, was a small carving of a love heart. Stumbling over my own feet, I turned and started marching back along the stream, as I had the day before. I just wanted to get out of there. As I traipsed through the forest, I tried to gauge my direction by using the mountain positions. The only problem was that I was in a valley, surrounded by mountains. If I was going in the wrong direction, I wouldn't know until it was far too late to hope to just turn around and go the other way. I don't know how long I had been walking for, but I imagined I'd been walking the stream until about midday, as the sun was almost dead center in the sky above. I remember allowing myself a few moments to stare up at the sky, wishing I was a bird so I could fly away from this nightmare. I scolded myself, sternly reasserting that dreaming was giving up, and that I needed to keep moving, keep busy. I once again marched on through the woods, praying that I was going in the right direction. I tried to keep my thoughts from the skull and the singing, and as the day wore on, I found this easier to do, because I began to understand my worst fears coupled with a knife wound to the gut had come to fruition. I was almost certain I had now gained an infection through my wound. Which one wasn't clear to me, if not both, and I panicked myself with the thought of dying out in the wilderness from illness. I tried to focus and bolster myself against the target of reaching a road or a structure. In the horror films, there's always a shack in the woods or an old house. But this was real life. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing for miles, just wilderness. I contemplated a few times maybe just heading back towards the mountains, as I knew that there would be trails in them and other campers, but I wasn't sure I'd survive a climb in my present condition, and without a definite trail to start from. I couldn't afford to waste my valuable energy on dead ends or climbing, and with how low my strength was getting, I doubted I could climb anyway. It was around that time that the hunger started to really play havoc with me. I felt tight cramping knots deep inside my stomach. They were severe and agonizing. I doubled over a few times, and this made me realize that it was likely the beginning of me starving coupled with having a knife wound in my gut. I hadn't expected it to kick in quite so fast. It had been about 2 days since I had eaten at this point, and I honestly thought I'd hold out a little longer. As I pushed myself on through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It felt as though someone was with me, but every time I checked, I found nothing. As once again the sun began to drop behind the trees, the cold started to eat away at me. I decided to once again dig a trench to sleep in. As I plunged my hands into the dirt, I noticed blood leaking from my stomach. My temporary bandage job had begun to fall apart, and the wound was no better than before and looked infected. I clutched my stomach in pain and shock. I removed my boots and socks before replacing them and washed the socks in the stream as best I could. I tied them both together and wrapped them around my waist, trying to force the makeshift wound coverings tighter against my skin. I went back to digging my ditch, but noticed the blood kept coming. At this point, I decided I was just going to walk. I needed to get help, and sleeping here might mean I never woke up again. I pulled myself together and began stumbling on alongside the stream. As I walked in the darkness, fumbling my way through the woodland hellscape, I started to hallucinate. I kept imagining headlights in the distance, and whenever I ran to them, they would stay the same distance away. During one of these hallucinations, I tripped and fell hard onto my face. I lay in the dirt, breathing in soil and razor-sharp cold air through my nose. I squeezed my eyes shut and steeled myself, not wanting to give in to the urge to cry. And then, what couldn't have been more than 50 yards away from me? Be sure it's true when you say I love you, because it's a sin to tell a lie. I couldn't believe that this guy had found me again. I spun around and, in the darkness, I could just about make out his slender frame. He seemed to be walking briskly towards me, singing in that low, raspy voice, like sandpaper and chalk. I sprinted for it, running as hard as my legs would allow. A limp in my every other step seemed to make each footfall 1,000 years longer than the last. I could no longer hear him singing. Instead, he was giggling and cackling, like a child chasing a butterfly. I could hear his pounding steps behind me. The freezing night air burned my lungs like petrol, and I wheezed and coughed as my stomach pulsated pain throughout my abdomen. My leg, while seemingly mostly healed by now, seared as I forced my fatigued and damaged muscles to carry me further than they were willing to. The stranger was ever present behind me, though, and showed no signs of slowing. In the distance, I could just make out in the pale moonlight what looked to be a rocky outcrop at the beginning of some foothills to the mountains. I pushed as hard as I could to reach them. My lungs blazed and my chest heaved as I ran, smashing through the pain as hard as I possibly could, my every motion sending vibrations of pain through my body. As I reached the outcrop, I dived into a narrow alleyway between two low rocky walls and scrambled on all fours to the end of it. I darted left amongst some more rocks and noticed an overhang, with no more than maybe 12 to 14 inches of space between it and the ground. I wedged through myself forcefully into the gap and sidled underneath. I prayed he wasn't still behind me. As my heartbeat stabilized and I fought to control my breath, trying to tune my ears to the ambience around me, I could hear his feet slapping on the rocks and grass. I held my breath and listened for him. He rounded the corner of a set of rocks, and I watched him scanning for me. I swear he looked right at me and somehow didn't see me. He walked over to where I was and paced, before circling around and around the rocks. I could hear him grunting and chuckling under his breath. Every now and again he seemed to pause and catch his breath before continuing to look around for me. I could see the homemade bone knife gripped in his hand. My stomach seemed to lurch in recognition of the tool that had inflicted its current state upon it. I tried to control my breathing as best I could, which was extremely hard, as the pain in my legs, stomach, and chest was beginning to bleed through the adrenaline rush, and I desperately wanted to hyperventilate in a mixture of panic and pain. I fixed my stare on the man, willing him to just leave. Then I noticed my blood on the rocky floor beside me. My eyes widened as I realized my blood was pooling beneath me. I must have pulled the wound as I slid under the rocks. I prayed to a God I didn't believe in that the man wouldn't step in it, as he was barefoot and would surely feel the sticky wet below his toes. I glared at his feet, leathery and black soles, with yellow and jagged overgrown thick toenails. Suddenly, he shrieked and cackled and skipped merrily into the woods and away from the rock face I was stuffed inside of. I let out a low, long and deep breath through pursed lips. I closed my eyes and let my head drop onto the hard, cold rock. I'm almost certain I started to cry in that moment, and I don't remember anything else, apart from that the next morning I awoke underneath that little outcrop, my body shaking in pain from laying in such an awkward solid place. I gingerly pulled myself from under the rock, and for some reason of all the things to come to me in that moment was the saying, "Where have you been living?" Under a rock. I chuckled at myself. Was I going mad? I leaned against the rock face and breathed deeply. I looked down at my stomach, relieved to see the bleeding had stopped again, miraculously. The gravity of my ordeal was beginning to weigh down on me. I came to terms with the fact that whoever this man was obviously lived out here. He clearly knew the area well, and obviously he could track. Either that or he was always watching me and just waiting to play with me. I began to understand then that my only real option was to keep moving and eventually I might find something. Or hopefully, I'd die in my sleep. I didn't want to die at the hands of that man. He'd already proven once that if he got his way, it wouldn't be a quick death. I staggered away from the rocks and back into the woods. My feet had erupted in blisters and sores from my lack of socks due to my using them to bind my wounds. Every step was torturous and slow. That day passed as the ones before. I started to make peace with the fact that either I was going the wrong way or I had fallen in a very unlucky place, because 3 days of solid walking had not turned up anything remotely close to civilization. I began holding out hope that once the weekend passed and my absence was noticed, my friends and family might not just write it off because of my experience. I had always told them if I was late to report it, especially if it was a day or so. If I was thinking straight, it would now be Monday, and so surely someone would realize I was gone. In the twilight hours, as crepuscular animals began to forage for food, I found myself slipping to the base of a tree and shivering in the cold. I pulled my survival knife out of my jeans and looked at the serrated blade. I contemplated waiting for the man, but surely in my current state he would overpower me far too easily. I could have easily sat at the base of that tree for a good few hours staring at that blade, before I hauled myself to my feet and continued my long trek towards what I hoped would be salvation. I don't remember that night. It was almost like a fever dream, stumbling through the forest. But I do remember that just before sunrise, I heard someone following me. Their heavy footfalls were shadowing my own. Immediately, I knew it was him. I decided that what would happen would happen. I was beyond caring. I gripped the survival knife in my frail hand and walked on. I finally came to a large open rock field and realized I hadn't fallen into the valley properly, but onto a large plateau around halfway down the mountainside, which probably saved my life. At the edge of the plateau was a set of high rock faces on both sides, and then a sheer drop directly ahead of me. I fell to my knees as I now knew I had been going the wrong way. Below the sheer drop was what looked like endless miles of trees. I began to cry, and then I heard him, giggling and shrieking like a child behind me. I heard him start to walk, then jog, then sprint at me. This was it. Me or him, I thought. I whirled around low and slashed wildly out, catching his thigh with my knife. He let out an, "Oh," as if to say, "I didn't know you were fun," and darted back, hopping and jumping like Spring-Heeled Jack in an old story. He lunged and slashed at me. I moved to avoid his knife, and he crashed into me, biting into my shoulder hard. I cried out in agony as his hideous jagged teeth tore into my muscle. I brought the knife into his ribs and stabbed 3 times before he brought his knife to my own ribs. We viciously stabbed at each other until one of us, I'm not certain who, fell away first, shortly followed by the other. My vision was pulsing slowly as blood rushed from my body. I clambered to grab my knife back up, just as he crawled onto me. He slashed down at my face, and I held up my hand to stop him. He sliced the palm of my hand open and giggled loudly. In a sudden fit of rage, I rolled over on top of him and brought my knife into his arm twice, before he returned 2 more stabs at me, one of which pierced my lung. I panicked and sucked in a horrible, hissing sharp breath, which caused unbelievable pain in my chest. In a sheer panic, I slammed my knife into the side of his neck as he lay below me, and I fell to the side. I don't remember anything more than us lying side by side, gargling, gasping, and hissing in a sickening cacophony of the sounds of death. My next memory is of being woken up in a hospital. I was told that I had been found likely a few hours after the fight. The man, too, had been rescued by the same helicopter crew that rescued me. I was told he had survived, although we had both been in critical condition when we arrived at a mountain trauma center, before then being sent on to a hospital. Police had kept both of us under guard, due to the wounds and knives found with us. After I had given a statement, and the police had concluded that the man was insane, the full story began to unfold. I later learned he was a war veteran. He had gone missing shortly after being medically discharged from the military and had vanished into a nature reserve nearly 12 years ago. After I learned of his past and spoke to his family members, I decided not to seek charges. I was just glad to be alive. My family and friends begged me never to go out again, but of course after 3 years, I did, and ever since I have never been in a situation like that one. At the end of my ordeal, I was told I had survived against insane odds. My doctors told me I had a bad stab wound to my stomach, which was indeed infected. My leg had healed on its own, but some muscular damage had remained. I also sustained 6 piercing stab wounds to my upper ribs under my left arm, a slashing wound to my palm, as well as a deep penetrating stab wound to my lower left lung. I had also contracted a very serious infection through my earlier wounds, and completely unbeknownst to myself, I had fractured 5 ribs, broken 1, and cracked my femur. It took me nearly 5 months of recovery to be at the level of health I was before the ordeal. I have no hidden message to impart. This story is so unbelievable, and it just seems like something that really doesn't happen apart from in movies. I have no advice because I refuse to believe this shit could ever be common. All I can say is as I did before. If you live in a wooded area or like to hike or camp, learn survival basics from a local SAR course or even scouts. And for those of you wondering how they found me, my family had indeed reported me as missing. Luckily, I had given them all the needed information, and a hiker had actually found my backpack sitting in the middle of a lower trail, below the one I had fallen from, and so the SAR team had 3 good points of reference to start from: my car, my first camp, and then where the bag was found. They also found my blood using dogs on the trails, and eventually a team had apparently been sent in to look for me below the mountain. I never knew that they were likely only ever a day behind after my first night after the fall from the mountain, and I still don't understand how I never once heard the helicopter that was assisting them or anyone else shouting for that matter. All I know now is that what happened to me motivates me to search even harder on operations. Knowing how grateful I was that someone was looking for me and found me pushes me to bring the same sense of joy to another. Keep safe out there, folks. Third story. How to kill a Wendigo. My twin sister Jenny was murdered at age 16. I witnessed it like a coward from atop a tree in the forest where it happened. I'd actually blacked out the memory for a while. I knew she was dead, but I couldn't remember how it happened. It wasn't until I tried therapy that it slowly came back to me. I was also reminded of how much my parents used to fight. Our family was planning on a camping trip the day before my sister's death. Before leaving, my parents erupted into another massive fight. Jenny and I had been looking forward to the trip, and once again our parents' awful communication skills was ruining it before it even began. We snuck out of the house and took a lift to the forest. We left our phones at home, not caring whether our parents would be worried sick. We enjoyed ourselves the first day. I set up our tent, made a fire, had s'mores, and did all that stuff one typically associated with camping. The next morning everything changed. I woke up alone in our tent. Outside I hear my sister talking to someone. Inquisitive, I opened the tent and saw someone sitting at our now-out campfire who looked just like me. The figure transformed as soon as Ginny realized it wasn't me. Together we ran off, that thing rushing after us with heavy steps. I was faster than my sister and a bit more athletic. I grabbed onto a tree branch and climbed up a tree. Ginny was not so lucky. I watched it happen. I watched that thing tear my sister to pieces. I'm still haunted by her screams. I also understand now why she always appears badly mutilated in my nightmares. I stayed up in that tree overnight, my sister's corpse lying in the leaves. Her remaining eye always staring up at me. While in therapy, there was a moment when I suddenly recalled the hallucination I had the morning after my sister's death. I thought I saw her corpse clawing at the tree where I hid. She wanted me to come down and join her. It caused me to panic and cry out. A couple of men who had been camping in the area heard my screams, and at last I was rescued. My parents don't argue anymore. I hardly see them at all anymore since my sister's death. We're an upper-middle-class family. Over the last couple of years, my parents have frequently gone on vacations. They don't tell me where, and I never ask. I usually just wake up and find out they've left yet again. I'm out of high school now, and I have no career path yet. I've only really had one thing on my mind since I remembered what killed Jenny. Now I'm returning to the forest where she died. Now I'm going to go after the thing that killed her. I've been preparing for this, and if it is a Wendigo like I've suspected, then I'm more than ready to take my revenge. This is how I'm doing it. I took a lift again. Had the driver known what I was carrying in my bags, I doubt they would have let me in. As I sat there, the realization of what I was doing grew heavily on me. What the hell am I doing? I've been talking myself up for the last couple of years. As much as I want a glorious victory, the closer I've come to this day, the more I daydream about dying the same way Jenny did. As angry as I am with my parents, I don't think they deserve to lose their only remaining child. But I just can't move on knowing that thing is still out there. My legs were as dense as gold once I tried to exit the cab. The driver watched awkwardly as I struggled to pull myself out while putting on my backpack and working to carry the other supplies. Why was I doing this alone? I don't want anyone else getting hurt in this, I think was my reasoning. But God, I wish I wasn't out here doing this alone. With each step I took into the forest, the more the terror numbed. I was in the domain of the Wendigo now. I wasn't entirely sure how much of the information about them was real. I knew they could change their appearance. I know that their true form is just like the drawings people have made. There's no way to be an expert on these things unless you've actually dealt with one. I'm still not sure why it decided not to come after me. Based on its size, I doubt it would have had any difficulty. Instead, I'm still alive and crazy enough to come back and pick a fight. As I set up camp, I found myself jumping at the sound of any bird call or movement from a nearby animal. The way I hammered in my tent, I knew I was calling attention to myself. In my left pants pocket was a gun. Like werewolves, I'd heard that silver bullets were necessary to kill Wendigos. What if I'm wrong? The thought had been with me ever since I'd stepped foot back into these woods. I stopped frequently while setting up. Behind nearby tree, I was almost certain I could see someone watching me and then hiding behind it again. I didn't bother to walk over and check it out. I finished up my tent and made up my sleeping bag inside. As I did this, I heard calls that sounded almost human off in the distance. It probably knew I was here. The minutes went by slowly, but soon dusk set upon the forest. I built a fire like the one Ginny and I had made. I roasted 2 marshmallows. Despite her absence, I made a s'more for her as well, resting it on a sizable rock near the fire. As I ate it, I thought about our last night together. All things considered, it was pleasant. Being twins, we had moments where we'd gotten into arguments like our parents. We'd fought one another. We had our problems. But that night had been pleasant. I'd actually been glad we'd decided to camp without our parents. As frightened as I still was, I felt a warmth not from the fire. A sense of calm overcame me as my memories were suddenly flooded with the good times Ginny and I had. The good times were not for long. I could hear footsteps not far behind me. Jeremy. I could never forget that voice. It sounded just like Ginny, but I knew it wasn't her. For some reason, I felt compelled to sit there calmly. As it approached, I could tell it was going over to take a seat at the rock where I'd left the Esmore. I glanced delicately to my right. I watched as a figure that looked almost identical to the Ginny I remembered pick up the Esmore and take a bite. "That's not yours." I surprised myself blurting that out. The fake Ginny ignored me, continuing to scarf it down. My terror turned to anger. The thing responsible for my sister's death was standing right next to me, mocking my grief. I didn't wait for it to finish. I pulled out my gun and pointed it directly at the figure. Before I could fire, the creature jumped to the left and turned around. I was struck with paralysis when I saw the mutilated face of my sister's corpse staring back at me. "I'm trapped, Jeremy." I struggled to keep aim. How dare that thing pretend to be her? It won't let me go. And it won't let you go either. We can be together again. It's so much nicer than going home to an empty house and unloving parents. She held her hand out to me. "Trust me, brother. Please." My trigger finger felt as though struck with a serious case of arthritis. Ginny took a step towards me. Wait, no. It's not Ginny. Why did I suddenly forget that? Feed the forest with me, Jeremy. It's so much better being dead. PR, prove it. At last I pulled the trigger. The creature hollered in pain as it fell to the ground. I'd hit a lung, which wouldn't be enough. I aimed the gun at its heart, but failed to pull the trigger as it rolled over and jumped back to its feet. Within seconds, it transformed from a corpse of my sister to its massive dark skeletal form with massive antlers. My mind was caught between fight and flight. I stood there aiming my gun, but desperately wanted to flee. As it rushed towards me, I chose the later option. I rushed over to the bag I'd left near the tent. Inside was a weapon I'd built myself. As I rushed over, I could tell I wasn't going to be able to outrun it. I fired another shot. The bullet lodged itself inside the neck of the beast. It cried out once more, buying me a bit of time to get to the bag. Why did I have it zipped up? As I tried to open it, the Wendigo rushed towards me again. Just like on the day of Jenny's death, I ran from the campsite, further into the forest. History was repeating itself. I was going to fail to avenge my sister. My parents were going to lose their last remaining child, all because I couldn't let this go. After at least several minutes, I'd somehow managed to keep outrunning it. I refused to slow down and look behind my shoulder. As I kept running, I noticed that I'd gone in some sort of circle. Up ahead of me was the campsite. I had a chance to grab the bag and pulled out the weapon. The closer I came to the campsite, the louder the Wendigo's footsteps became. I could almost feel the wind as the creature tried to claw at me. Once I reached the campsite, I put my hand out, clutching the bag. It felt like almost too great a risk to put my gun back in my pocket, but I needed free to pull out the weapon. I managed to do just that and used my left hand to pull out a long metal spike. I'd built it in such a way as to have the spike shoot out at the push of a button. The Wendigo wasn't going to slow down until it had me. I had no choice. I had to turn around. I had to have perfect timing. I had to collect my debt from the creature that took my twin sister. Chew on this, you son of a bitch. I turned around, pressing the button that shot the spike out. Less than a foot from my face was the Wendigo, its cry so loud my ears hurt and began to ring. I'd done it. The spike had pierced the heart. Silver. Weakly, the Wendigo tried to swipe at me, but somehow lacked the strength. The next part was a gamble. I pulled out my gun and shot it in the head. It wasn't going to be enough to end the Wendigo assuming what I'd read up was correct. I rushed back over to where I'd dropped my bag. Inside was a silver axe I'd also designed myself. When I returned, the creature was still conscious, letting out continuous agonizing cries. I felt no sympathy. I hacked away at its wrists first. Its claws were the biggest threat, and I wanted them gone. Despite the weightlifting I'd been doing, it took over a dozen hacks to remove the first long-fingered hand. I pulled out my gun and shot it again in the head. It subdued the creature long enough for me to remove the second hand, and then I began on its head. As it began waking up again, I found myself screaming at the creature. I demanded it stay dead, calling it every insulting name that came to mind. Once I'd hacked most of the way through its head, I pulled it off. I kicked it a couple of feet away. The Wendigo no longer moved. It took over an hour, but I'd managed to put each limb, the head, and torso in the trash bags I'd brought along. One by one, I carried them back to the campsite. I lit another fire, burning each bag. It took until dawn for me to burn the body. I left the torso for last. It was a struggle, but I managed to remove the heart, rip it to pieces, and placed it in a silver box. After locking it, I looked around the site and decided to leave everything except my gun and the box behind. I was never particularly religious, but in the months leading up to my fight, I'd gotten to know a priest at a church in my area called Street Alphonsus. Luckily for me, he was there when I arrived with the silver box. His face went several shades paler when I showed it to him. Nevertheless, he escorted me to the back of the church with a pair of shovels and helped me bury it. Once done, I sat there, suddenly flooded with overwhelming emotions. I did it. The Wendigo had been slain. I'd done it. My sister's killer was dead. Its body was burned, its heart in pieces and buried. Jenny, I cried out. I kept my promise. I killed it. The Wendigo can't get anyone else. It won't kill anyone else. I placed my lowered head in my hands and continued to cry. I'm sorry I wasn't braver before, I whimpered. I'm so sorry I wasn't stronger before. I placed some flowers on my sister's grave an hour later. I talked of her tombstone as though she was there listening. I'd like to believe she was and that she was pleased with my accomplishment. Afterwards, I returned home and slept through the day and all night. Once morning came, I heard some noise downstairs. I went down to see that my parents were home and sitting down to breakfast. They stopped and looked over at me, saying nothing. I walked over and pulled up a seat. I had no appetite at all. How was your trip? Where did you guys go? My parents exchanged looks before my father replied. We went out west to visit your aunt and uncle. Did you, enjoy it? I had difficulty keeping my chin from quivering as I lowered my head again. Jeremy, sweetie, what's wrong? Both my mother and my father got up and came over to me. Why do you keep leaving me alone? God damn it. I'm the only kid you have left. Don't you give a fuck about me? They hugged me tightly, offering apologies. I could have sworn I felt another pair of hands on my shoulders. Their light touch was the most comforting of all. I really hope Jenny is proud of me. But a new task was ahead of me now. A harder task, perhaps. I was going to have to figure out how to reconcile with my parents. Our family had been broken long before her death. We'll never be whole again, but I know with some effort we can be better than this. I hope she can continue to give me the strength to put myself together as I progress into adulthood. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.